Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. This video is part of the ongoing series where we introduce some of the people at Chaosium that you might not have already met. I sat down recently with Sim. Sim is the in-house layout artist and designer for Chaosium. They have put together a bunch of books, and their job is to make those books look good and be intelligible to players who want to read them. In this video, they share a bunch of advice on how to get into the industry. They talk about their own story, and they talk about some of the inspirations to their work. I'll jump across to the interview in just a moment, but first, please remember to subscribe, and thanks for watching.
The short version is that I make books look pretty. The longer version is that I do graphic design, layout, art input, but not art direction, for multiple lines at Chaosium.
What's the skill set that allows you to do that? Do you have training in a particular area, or is it just a wealth of experience that's brought you to this position?
I went to university and got a graphic design degree. I graduated in 2007. So it is something I learned to do professionally, but it took me a long time to really get started.
When people talk about the many different roles that go into running a company like Chaosium, they'll often talk about creative facing roles or production facing roles. And I don't necessarily think that that analogy is perfect, because all jobs are really creative and everybody kind of has their hands in logistics. But I'd love to hear how you define your role. Where do you think you fit within the larger machine?
Yeah, I would say mine is more back-end creative. I don't have a lot of customer or fan interaction, but I do feel like my role is I feel like my role is important because I determine what the fans are going to see. I don't determine by myself. I work with the whole creative visual team, but I do have a lot of input into into how a book is going to look at the end.
And just to give us as fans a little fly on the wall moment, if we were to drop into your office when you are neck deep in doing something, what would we see you doing?
You will see me hunched over a computer, looking at three monitors, scrolling through typefaces, editing photos in Photoshop, uh, and adjusting text, and looking at Word documents and art documents and trying to figure out how everything goes together. I would not say it is a glamorous thing to watch, but I enjoy it a lot.
What aspect of the job gets you most into a flow state, for want of a better word? What is the part that you love that you could do all day?
I really like typography. For a lot of people, letters are just letters, but I think a lot about what type I'm using, how it looks, how the letters are spaced, how it looks on a page, not just through words, but if you look at a page with all of the text kind of makes its own shapes. So when I'm hands deep, like neck deep in text and typography, I will do that and forget to eat. I'll be there for hours just adjusting text and making sure everything falls on the right page. I think letters are really interesting.
Apart from your own body of work, you look at anybody else out there and you see their products and you think that is the kind of thing that I think is very, very expertly done, or this was brilliantly executed, even if it's just from the perspective of your field particularly and not necessarily the rest of the content that surrounds it.
Oh yeah, I buy a lot of books, not just RPG books. I look at board games, I look at books, I look at art books, like the kind you would get at a museum. I'm always studying people's layout and graphic design in general, and also illustrations. I look at posters, all kinds of things to get ideas.
How long have you been working with Chaosium? What's the sort of story of you coming in? How did that all happen?
I've been with Chaosium for 5.5, maybe 6 years. I am friends with Studio Agate. I met them ages ago because I used to own and run a game store. And I met them through the game store. I became very good friends with their head, Nell, And Nell introduced me to Chaosium 6 years ago when we were rebooting the RuneQuest line because we finally got it back in, and it just took off from there.
All artists have their own areas where they have to start looking into other things. Maybe a filmmaker who has to understand lights, or maybe a oil painter who has to understand chemistry and cooking of various bits and pieces. As somebody who specializes in graphic design, and you mentioned typefaces and things like that, what's some of the other disciplines or other fields of knowledge you've had to bring into your work?
I've looked into a lot into printmaking. So printmaking is a kind of art. It's basically an umbrella term for any time you take ink and put it onto a page. So there's lithography, there's letterpress, there's the linoleum blocks, wood blocks. So I look at that a lot because that is essentially like pre-modern graphic design. So if you look at someone like Muka, who made these beautiful movie posters with these illustrations on them, that's graphic design, except it was all done by hand. So I look at a lot of letterpress and printmaking stuff is something I take in a lot, and just general illustrations, because it's something I'm trying to get stronger at too, is being able to incorporate drawings or illustrations into the designs I'm doing.
Who's a great artist outside the TTRPG space that we might not have heard of and we might not realize is in all of the books that we bring out?
So one of my big inspirations outside of the tabletop gaming industry it's a person, but also just a magazine. It was called Raygun Magazine. It was art directed and designed by David Carson. This was back in the 90s. I don't think it went on past like 2001. It may have been cut off earlier than that. But David Carson and the team behind Raygun Magazine, they just made some of the most experimental graphic design layout stuff that I've ever seen. They mixed photography and illustration and letter forms and all these different things together. And sometimes the articles weren't even readable, but it was always very interesting to look at and very inspiring. Because a lot of RPGs are 2 columns, and sometimes you want to get more interesting than that. So looking at that work, it gives me inspirations on like things I can do to make images and text like interact in more interesting ways.
What's a concern that you come up against in your day-to-day work that we wouldn't even have considered is a question in TTRPGs? Something that you constantly find yourself wondering about, but that doesn't appear in the mind of most people who play the games.
Well, one thing that a lot of people may not think about is I have an art sheet. So we have art that has to go in. We have sidebars. We have tables. And I think a lot of people don't understand kind of the Tetris work that is required to get all of that in the right place and the right time in the book. And I think even the writers don't understand this a lot of the time, where someone will say, "Oh, we'll just add this text," but when you add a text or you add an image, it shifts the entire book a certain way. So it may look like you can just take out a paragraph, but if you take out a paragraph, all this text comes backwards. Suddenly the art's not lined up. Maybe the chapter ends on the wrong page. It's like a lot of little detail stuff like that. Those are like some of my big challenges. But a lot of people, it's not, no one really thinks about, oh, what if this paragraph wasn't there? If that paragraph wasn't there, maybe the entire chapter would be messed up.
And as a final point for anybody who's hearing about the work that you do, and either they are already in that field and want to take their experience into the TTRPG profession, or they find it just really exciting and want to learn more about it, what advice would you give people for improving their skills and for getting out there and working?
Definitely put yourself out, show your work to people, And the worst thing that will ever happen is someone will say no. You know, they'll look at your work and think, oh, not this time. But really, it's just a lot of practice, like a lot of work. So like I said, I've been doing this for 10 years, and every few weeks I'm discovering new and better ways to like improve my work. So it just is like doing it, you know, just sitting down and doing it. And if you want to lay out an RPG or something and you don't really know how to start, but you know how to do layout, go get a PDF of a book of a game you like, copy all the text, throw it in InDesign, and just play with it, make it up, you know. Just doing it, I think. It's it's hard because you know you think about a thing or you want to try a thing, but just do it. The worst thing that can happen is someone says no.